morning, everybody. Sorry I'm so late this morning. I wasn't used to the traffic here.
Should have come back an hour.
I should have done, yeah. You can tell I'm not Italian. So why am I in Italy developing a project there? The main reason is there's a big opportunity for developing inland waterways in Italy relative to the inland waterways in the UK, or relative to waterways in Northern Europe, i.e. France, Germany, Benelux, that are highly developed. The Italian system is not so developed. It's good to be here because actually I was born in Birmingham, so this is kind of coming back to where I was born, so it's really nice to be here. What I want to do in the presentation is to really show you the benefits of the waterway transportation relative to road, to highlight the obstacles that need to be overcome in order to move freight back onto waterways versus roads. The situation in Italy is probably quite similar to the situation here, where you have the vast majority of freight now moved by road, very little by rail, even less by waterway. And the need for inland waterways to evolve towards a zero emissions target, in other words, to have the pushers and propelled barges moving towards zero emissions. Firstly, a view of the situation in Italy. The three regions that the system, as you'll see when I put some maps up in a moment, the three regions that system covers have about 40% of Italy's GDP. So that's the Veneto, Lombardia, Emilia-Romagna. It's a diverse industry, very big concentration of industry, very diverse. You have steel, you have car manufacturing, remember those. You have agriculture, you have ceramics, you have all kinds of industry, both import and export. The rail freight services are inefficient, even by European standards. The operator in Italy is not very good. We have first-hand experience of their services, and they are pretty poor. So it's not really at this stage a viable alternative. The pipeline network, which is obviously very important for moving liquids, is not really developed either, because most of the refinery capacity in North Italy is on the west coast, and this system feeds from the Adriatic on the east. And finally, the road network is suffering from serious congestion in two ways. If you look at a map of Italy, you not only have the congestion associated with the industry itself, but it's also a major throughway for road traffic from France and Spain, south of the Alps to the Balkans. So it's a very, very congested part of Europe. And the congestion around the seaports, Venice, Ravenna, Trieste, Genova on the west coast, is really, really bad, because effectively you have 30,000-ton vessels coming in, unloading, pretty much everything being moved out by truck. So a complete nightmare around the ports. This gives you an overview of the industry concentrations in yellow. You can see this is the system we're talking about here, from the port of Venezia and Ravenna through this waterway system, servicing this triangle of territory from Milan, Ravenna to Venice. This is a map of the nitrogen dioxide emissions. So you can see that mirroring the industrial concentration. And the climate doesn't really help down there either. I mean, right now it's about 35 or 40 degrees and extremely humid. So it's, the pollution is really, really quite bad. So it's important that, from an environmental standpoint, that we move as much as we can back onto waterways and cut the number of trucks that are moving freight. The system itself, There are two waterways connecting the Adriatic to the industrial heartland. One is the Canale Bianco, which is a canal that has about a 2.5 to 3 meter draft, class 5 canal, operable 365 days a year. And you have the River Po, which is not so useful because it's tidal. There are very few locks. And so it's not really practical from the point of view of providing logistics, transportation services. There are highly developed trimodal ports in Rovigo, Mantova, Cremona, well connected to the railways as well as to the road networks. The industrial concentration, as I've said, is very heavy. The system really goes as far as about 50 kilometers to Milan. And Milan essentially being the capital of Italy in terms of industry. The infrastructure, about 100 million of 10T funding has been spent on the system in the past few years. So the infrastructure is being developed. Conversely, and paradoxically, only 200,000 tons, or around about that kind of volume, is being moved by waterway. Way, way below what the potential is. Here is a picture of the corridor going from Venice in the top, Ravenna at the bottom. If you take the three ports of Trieste, Venezia, Ravenna, you're getting towards a scale of a northern European port. If you look at those ports on a league table of European ports, they come way down the scale. The Adriatic is effectively a cul-de-sac in the Mediterranean, so it's not exactly Rotterdam. But combined, you have quite a lot of freight. The river system I mentioned, you see the heavy blue line, which is the River Po, and the small blue line just above it is the Canale Bianco. So we can move freight 365 days a year to Mantova, which is about the middle of northern Italy. You then, to move any freight to Cremona from Mantova and towards Milan, you're talking about navigability 10 to 11 months of the year.
What's that distance?
The distance to Mantova from the Adriatic is about 150 kilometers. To Cremona, 250. So from an economic standpoint in terms of waterways, it's not a long system. It's quite short. Here's the same system, but in diagrammatic form, showing the white marks of the locks. Now, if you're talking Cremona at 250 kilometers inland, there's only about 6 or 7 locks. So it's a pretty flat piece of territory. So it's essentially the river delta. It's the floodplain of the Po River coming down from the Alps. So you would take really the Canale Bianco to Mantova, then drop down to Cremona along the river, because in the lower part of the system from Mantova to the Adriatic, using the Po River, it's navigable 6 months of the year. Now that's completely useless, therefore, in terms of providing a service. It's useful in terms of being able to push barges when you have the draft, so it's a very quick way of getting back, but it's not really practicable from a commercial point of view. So last year we had tried for some years to develop a consortium within Italy to develop the waterways. There are 2 or 3 operators there right now. None of them are doing a particularly good job. And we tried to set up a company that was going to provide a service. That didn't work. And last year, we appreciated the fact that we needed to bring in a partner from another European country. So we signed an MOU with another company end of last year. We've identified the potential to move initially 2 to 3 million tons of freight. And we're in the process of finalizing the joint venture and we expect to start up early next year. The logic of the joint venture is that our European partner brings ISO 9001 and 14001 accreditation. Nobody in the Italian system, in the Italian waterways right now have that. The inland waterway, they obviously bring in the waterway experience. They've been in the business for 50 years. And they also have a policy of owning their own assets. So they're working in a mature market, owning a lot of assets. So here is a market that they can transfer some assets to. The Italian partner brings the relations with, the experience with respect to the ports, the customs and logistics, the waterway system and the regulatory authorities, and also customer relations. So as joint ventures go, it's a pretty good fit because both have a great deal to gain through that enterprise. Let's talk about the customers because they're pretty important. I mean, they're putting the money at the top of the column, making all of this possible. What do they need? In our experience, we've been talking now to customers for the last 3 years. In these hard times, need a competitive price because often they're looking for cost reductions in their supply chain. They also need multiple modes and intermodality. So they really need a solution, a delivered solution. So if we're proposing waterways to them, we have to cover the last few kilometers to their production plant. Sometimes we might have to store the material. We have to do the logistics. So they want a door-to-door service. So they need that intermodality. And trucks are obviously very important for those last few kilometers because very few of these customers are actually located on the canal or the river itself. And improvements in health and safety. They're looking for that also. We were in a chemical plant in Ravenna, and they were very keen about the idea of moving styrol, for example, from Mantova to Ravenna, because that means you have one process of unloading a volatile substance instead of 60 or 80. So from a health and safety point of view, from an operations point of view, they are very happy with the idea. Long-term emissions reductions, obviously. Hopefully pressure will increase on companies to examine very closely the emissions in their supply chains and to bring them down. But that is not, in our discussions with customers right now, that is not a priority. Just in terms of the relative efficiencies of road versus waterways, these are some stats from Inland Navigation Europe. From the point of view of fuel consumption and CO2 emissions in an articulated vehicle versus a barge, roughly a 3-to-1 ratio. And that's really coming obviously from economies of scale. I mean, if you're moving 60 to 80 containers or 1,500 tons of steel, then you're doing that once, not 60 or 80 times. Again, from the same organization, a comparison of the external costs and the infrastructure costs. The first column, as many of you may be aware, roads have a very high external cost. The cost of congestion, the cost of delays, the cost of accidents, and so on. The waterways, less so, much less. The maintenance of the infrastructure is comparable, but the inland waterways are, once you have built the infrastructure, then you're mainly dredging the canals and maintaining locks. So what are the barriers to change? If we're saying that we really need to be bringing more freight from the roads onto inland waterways, well, the first thing is that companies are fairly reluctant to change. I mean, if they have an established supply chain and it works for them, then it's a decision they don't make lightly. And it's not unusual to be in discussion with companies for 2 to 3 years before they will consider making such a large change as that. I mean, if you're a steel company, for example, importing steel coils into a process, your process is a very expensive one, and that's your priority. You want to make sure those coils are there on time. So it's a key component of their earnings statement, their profitability. Also concerns about reliability. If you are putting, right now they have many single truck operators. That's a good spread of risk. If a truck operator falls sick, it's not a problem. If you're putting a lot of your business with one operator on the waterways, they want to know that's going to work for them. So reliability is obviously fundamentally important. Other barriers, it's not really a level playing field in terms of bringing this volume back to the waterways. There's no real political appetite for climate change, for tackling climate change seriously. I mean, only yesterday, listening to the radio on the way up, Osborne was saying, I'm not going to increase the fuel duty. I'm going to put that off. Their focus is near-term and economic, not long-term environmental. No desire either to internalize a lot of these external costs, and that probably applies to pretty much all of the European countries. So much is moved by truck. If you begin to say to those operators, you are now going to have to start taking some of this cost back in, that will feed through into the economy and all kinds of problems. And obviously the significant investment required in buying the pushers and barges, hopefully with the joint venture proposals we're talking about, those assets already exist, so it takes away that particular barrier. But it is, if you want to set up this business, then that's clearly a major issue for you. I mean, if you're talking a moderate fleet of a few pushers and barges, you're easily talking 20 to 30 million euros. So, the need for progress towards zero emissions. It's the system that you've just seen on the map is a very delicate system. The delta of the Po River on the Adriatic is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a major site for migrating birds and other animals, beautiful area. And so clearly there has to be, we have to be very, very careful about incidents and pollution. And again, this is part of the reason for wanting to bring in an operator from Europe rather than climb the learning curve in Italy, because you want someone who has experience in handling a barge full of methanol on a waterway, especially if you're navigating a tidal river where the levels change. That's very, very important. So their experience, their ISO accreditation is fundamentally important. And finally, the need to improve engine technology. It's very easy to make the comparisons on a ton-kilometer basis between a truck and a barge and say, well, aren't we great? 3-to-1 ratio, just bring your business. Marine engines are still pretty filthy devices, and they need to be developed further if we're going to reduce pollution. And so, my interest in attending today is really to hear some ideas about how we might get towards zero emissions, because that's very important for us from an environmental standpoint long term. But also, if we can get the right kinds of hybrids or alternative propulsion systems in place, perhaps it will make us even more economic relative to roads. Because in this system, when you're talking about 150 kilometers to 200 kilometers, anything much less than 100 kilometers, and you're probably going to take it by truck anyway. So we're kind of on the edge in terms of competing with the roads. So anything we can do that can drive down our cost is a very welcome addition. And if you were talking about taking a barge of methanol from Venice to Mantova, you'd be talking, for the trip, you'd be talking about 3,000 euros of fuel in one trip. So it's a significant number for us in terms of our operating expense. This is one of the barges that we currently use. Just to give you some idea of scale, it's roughly 11 meters across, about 70, 80 meters long, with a pusher about 100 meters, thereabouts. About a 2.5 meter draft. So a sizable space. That could take about 1,500 to 2,000 tons of steel coils. With a bigger barge, you could move about 2,000 tons worth of soya. You could move 60 containers. That's not a lot. We're looking at introducing barge capacity that can move 90 containers to run a scheduled service between the Adriatic and Mantova. So it's a fairly, as Rex said, it's a fairly large scale compared to what we're used to in the UK. But it is still a system that needs to be developed. And I'm really interested to hear today some exchanges of ideas on how we might develop hybrid systems or hydrogen systems for this kind of operation. The pusher is a twin engine, about 600 horsepower per engine. So that's the kind of scale that we'd be looking for.
Thank you, Greg.
Okay?
How bad does it have to get before we think that's it?
I think that map showing the air quality is quite worrying. You know, I think in Milan, in some of the hot summers, they were rotating cars going into Milan. So it really is very bad.
I think, again, I saw a statistic some time ago that the biggest source of sulfur dioxide pollution in Northern Europe was from cross-channel ferries.
Yeah.
So it is pretty shocking stuff. Any questions? Ian? Ian Dillon.
You're talking about infrastructure development in canal and water systems. Who is paying for that?
Well, the funding has come from 10T in Europe. It's being, in Italy you find that Rome does very, very little in terms of infrastructure. All of the investment really is driven from the regions. So it's Lombardia, it's Veneto, those who have the system in place. So they are the ones who are really driving the agenda politically and in terms of getting the funding necessary to put the infrastructure in place.
And the funding from Brussels?
Yes. Yeah. European funding and also Italian funding.
Okay.
Chairman, it's been understood that one of the biggest distortions of trade is the difference in subsidy for different modes of transport. Most of European money, for instance, goes on helping the cheap Eastern European goods to come to Britain, so there's a balance of payments. That's the railways in this country have to pay their way, and we have a funny situation in which our canals are going to become a charity. How is all this going to affect the way in which we think develop?
I know that we only see the canals as a leisure activity, and I guess that will be carried over to the canal. Is it Canal and River Trust? I don't know where we are with that, but maybe. Yeah.
It is one of the benefits of the system here as well, relative to the UK, for example, is that we're not in competition with tourism here. That whole system, once you get outside of Venice, where there's obviously a lot of tourism and pockets of tourism along the system, there are no pleasure cruises, it's empty. You could stand on the bank of the canal for a whole day and not see one boat go past.
Yeah.
A couple of things. I won't talk about the British Waterways and Canal River Trust. We're in conflict with them on a daily basis. But in spite of that, we're trying to promote phrases, particularly in London. We're beginning to, in talking about financing, which somebody has already raised, to see where the money is. And the moment with the freight, of course, it's with the road transport.
Mm.
So we're considering working with the road people rather than in opposition.
Good.
That's very interesting, actually, because often talking to road lobby people, there's no ill will,
No.
but of course they're not engaged.
Mm.
But it's interesting because government, for instance, have passed over to the FDA, the Freight Transport Association in this country, a couple of initiatives, the sea and water operation, and a new one which has come up, which is about modal shift. Government can't run it, so they passed that over to the FDA,
Right.
and they've set up, just a matter of a few weeks ago, what they call a modal shift centre.
Ah, good.
So in fact, FDA have got a waterway division within their massive road lobby setup.
Mm-hmm.
Now we don't know what they're going to do with it.
Sit on it, probably.
Possibly. It might take a long time for it to get into their culture.
Mm.
But we've never found any ill will from the road transport people. And in fact, up in Manchester Ship Canal, Eddie Stobart is involved in their shipping thing. And so in fact, get them involved with it would be quite a useful way to go ahead. And is there anything comparable then you see in Italy working? Because you said working in opposition.
No, I temper that a little bit. Clearly what we want to do is to take away the long distance trips from the Adriatic to Mantova, Cremona. But there is always a place for road hauliers in terms of those last few kilometres. And for many of them, it probably works better anyway, because if you're getting much better truck utilisation. If you drive a truck from Venice to Cremona, it's going to take you half a day, then the truck is idle. You can't get 2 days. And so in many ways, it's their interest to have more volume but on shorter distances.
They're nice people to work with, actually, finding.
You have to work with them. It's very important because you have to look at it from we are an inland waterway supplier.
Yeah.
We are a supply chain.
The transport supply.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so therefore they are on the team as far as we are
Quite
concerned.
right, yes.
Absolutely right.
Any other questions? Yes, Alex.
Yeah, thanks for an interesting talk. Quick question. You mentioned that the boat behind you on the screen, you said it was 600 horsepower per engine, there's two of them. Is that peak power or is that when it's cruising along with you?
Don't know. Not sure. I'm a finance guy, not an engineer, I'm afraid, but
It's
but
deep,
I suspect.
I can find out for you.
Yeah. Any question? Oh, yes, sorry.
Received wisdom about the relative efficiency between water transport and road transport that I've had was much more optimistic than 3 to 1.
Mm.
I mean, presumably as you're right in the middle of it and looking at feasibility studies and everything, this is realistic. Was it because these barges are so unstreamlined, because they are shaped by the cargo rather than by the efficiency of the hull, or I mean 3 to 1 does sound much more pessimistic than what I've been given to believe is more in the order of 6 to 1.
Our experience, because obviously we look at trucking costs from the Adriatic to Mantova, and we look at the costs associated with moving by barge. And I agree with you, 3 to 1 is cautious, and that's probably just inland navigation Europe being, very, conservative. My experience is 4 or 5, so at least in terms of the fuel efficiency I'm talking about.
Because one large lorry could have a big Cummins engine, say 300
Yeah.
horsepower, 400 horsepower, lorry, which is going to carry a fraction of what that can carry, and you've got effectively 3 times the engine capacity of a 30-ton lorry. So
Yeah.
I would have thought
Yeah.
it's got to be way more efficient.
Well, I agree with you. I did my own calculations about 4 or 5 times, and that was assuming a 30-ton truck, i.e. full capacity on the truck, and it's not always going to be like that. So I agree with you. I think it's fairly conservative.
It's an incredible advantage, though, isn't it, really? I mean,
It is, and you know,
Why are we discussing it?
well, for me, we have to proceed with the project, assuming the status quo. We can't rely on the politicians, on climate change, or the internalisation of cost. For me, the biggest factor is the oil price. I think as long as it stays down below $100 a barrel and stays there, it's going to be incredibly difficult, increasingly difficult to transfer this kind of freight across without the structural changes we're talking about. If you get back to where it was in 2008, $150 a barrel, then people suddenly start sitting up and taking notice. Companies start looking at their supply chains, truck operators start, screaming. Nobody wants high fuel prices, but I'm thinking that maybe that's what it's going to take.
Can a market economy cope with climate change?
It's going to have to. But it'll be a slow process.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Chris. No more questions? We'll move on to the next one. Thank you very much indeed.